And we're live! Hello everyone and welcome to Samanthropolitics, a show where we talk about global politics and women's rights. We have a great show coming up.
On the military for the genocide against the Rohingya. So
as these poor people are being attacked, people are hiding in their offices. You guys saw a guest.
We're going to be talking about Burma and Russia today, but just a quick U.S. Native American Secretary of the Interior. Now, this is really monumental because
I'm Samantha Carlin, your host of Samanthropolitics, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
And we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Samanthropolitics, a show where we talk about global politics and women's rights. I'm super excited to be here today. We have a great show coming up for you. Barbara Slavin is here from the Atlantic Council. She is an unbelievably brilliant expert on Iran and the Middle East and has been researching Iran for decades. She's also just a wonderful person. So you'll get to see her in a little while. Before then, we're going to do a few global news updates to find out what else is going on in the world. So last Tuesday, the United States Senate unanimously passed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act. This officially established June 19th as a federal holiday, which means no parking tickets. That always makes me happy. But more importantly, it recognizes the end of slavery in the United States. Now, the holiday originated from Galveston, Texas, where in 1865, they recognized June 19th as the African American Emancipation Day. This has been there's been a lot of pressure to make this a federal holiday for a really long time. And it's kind of wild that it hasn't been earlier because the end of slavery was such a hallmark for America in terms of progress, in terms of growth, in terms of who we are as a nation and what we stand for. And it liberated all of these people from oppression and abuse. I mean, a really pivotal moment. And so it was really exciting that June 19th is finally a national holiday. And there were tremendous celebrations in Washington, D.C. and all over the country celebrating the final turn of this into a national holiday. Some other American news. Republicans blocked discussion of a new bill that would limit the suppression of voter rights that's happening in a lot of state legislatures. So what's so wild to me about this is that they didn't block voting on the bill. They blocked the discussion of the bill. They blocked even being able to take the bill to the floor and say, "Hi, what do you think? Hi, what do you think? Hi," like make some arguments for it, make some arguments against it. And I think this is just such a clear indication that they know that the Republicans know that voter suppression laws help them win. Because when you limit, because most of these voter suppression laws happen in areas where there are people of color who are more likely to be Democratic. And when you suppress the vote in those areas, you usually lose Democratic votes. And so Republicans know it's not advantageous to them to basically have any sort of bill like this. And they're loving the fact that this is happening in state legislatures all over the country while the Democrats control Congress. But I think the one thing I think about with the Republican Party and voter suppression measures is if the only way that you can win is to block people from voting and exercising their American right to participate in our democracy, maybe you should start thinking about changing your platform and getting people to want to vote for you instead of blocking them to vote through archaic measures like there were in Texas, which limited early voting hours, tightening mail-in ballots, and cut lots of voting locations, even things like you can't give food or drinks to people at the polls who are waiting in line for hours. So I just don't understand. It's like, why don't you think about changing your platform so that people want to vote for you and put your energy into that instead of putting all your energy into these laws where you're limiting people's American right to vote. Another American news case that happened, the Supreme Court ruled in favor 8-1 of a young woman who cursed out her school on social media. Why did she curse out her school? She was a cheerleader and she did not make it to the varsity cheerleading team. So she went on social media and said some profanity laced language against the school. What did the school do? They kicked her off of the JV team. So this went all the way up to the Supreme Court to say, was the school validated in terms of their retaliatory measures against this young woman for posting profanity laced language towards them on social media? So the court basically ruled in favor of the young woman. Why is this important? Because it has implications for anyone, whether it's a student or an employee. If they say things on social media, can your employee fire you for something you say on social media? For example, that woman who gave the bird to Donald Trump as he was passing in his motorcade and was fired. If the Supreme Court case had already been decided, maybe that would have not been able to happen, or it would have been seen as discrimination or something. So really interesting case, especially as our personal worlds and our professional worlds collide. So other really interesting global news that just occurred. Israel. We've done episodes on Israel and Gaza. We've talked about Bibi Netanyahu and a kind of like, he had kind of turned into the Putin of Israel and had been in charge for 12 years and seemed very, very hard to get rid of. Well, Netanyahu is finally out, which is pretty unbelievable. His record 12-year run, longest prime minister, ended with the parliament approving a new government led by Naftali Bennett. And people were celebrating in the streets. This was after 4 inconclusive elections. And I think there was a lot of joy because Israel's kind of ready for something new. And I don't think it's good for anyone to be in power for that long, no matter what their stance is, because they begin becoming kind of a cult of personality and having such control over the people and the narrative of the country and the priorities that other voices don't really get a chance. So Naftali Bennett is now taking over in Israel. Other news breaking today: Donald H. Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense for both Presidents Gerald R. Ford and George Bush. He presided over, kind of wild, America's Cold War strategies in the 70s, and then again over the war in Iraq and the start of the war in Afghanistan. He is now dead at age 88. Barbara is going to comment on Donald Rumsfeld's death, and I'm excited to hear what she has to say about that. So before I get into Iran, I just wanted to make an exciting announcement. We now have a Patreon. What does that mean? That means if you like the show, you want to see more content, support us on Patreon. Even $3 a month, $5 a month helps us do the work that we do so that we can report on global politics and get this coverage to you. So I'm going to have one of the lovely production assistants post a link to our Patreon in the chat. So please consider making a donation. And I also want to thank our sponsor, Stream Inspectors, and my company, Empower Global. If you're looking for diversity training, please look up empowerglobal.net. So let's get into the story of the day. The Iranian election. So it's kind of wild that these lined up together. But in addition to Israel having had an election for a new president, so did Iran. So Rouhani could not run. He's the current president of Iran, because he had already served 2 consecutive terms in office. So who won? Is Ricey of the Combatant Clergy Association Party. That name is just crazy to me. What's so wild about this was that, did he really win? Because people boycotted the election. So basically what happened was they ruled out any moderates that were put forward to run, basically ensuring that this was a rigged election regardless. So what happened? All the moderates came out and said, don't vote, or all the leftists said, don't vote. There were also journalists that were threatened for writing about candidates. So it was the lowest voter turnout in the country's history, democratic history, 48%. So why is Ricey so controversial? Well, he was apparently one of 4 judges who in the 80s, he oversaw the execution of thousands of members of Iranian political prisoners, which included women and children. He also has a history of anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism. There's something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was basically this book that was written years ago that says that the Jews are trying to dominate the world. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but we're not. There is no Jewish conspiracy to dominate the globe. And he was really instrumental in spreading the propaganda of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion with the foundation that he was involved in. So pretty worrying for Jewish people. A second piece of big news re Iran, which was breaking news this week, is that the US just carried out another round of airstrikes against Iranian backed militias in Iraq and Syria. It was in response to drone attacks that were perpetrated by Shia Iranian backed militias in Iraq and Syria on American bases in Iraq and Syria. This has been going on for quite some time now. And, the Iranian backed militias originally were in Iraq and Syria to fight ISIS. So the US didn't care about them as much. And then once ISIS was quote unquote gone or had dissipated, all of a sudden the Iranian backed militias were targeting us. The other thing that's interesting about this is that Iran won't directly admit that they're sponsoring these militia groups, but everybody kind of knows that they're getting funding and military equipment from Iran. So it's kind of like we're fighting a proxy war with Iran, but also just fighting a war with Iran with these Iranian-backed militias. But basically, President Biden decided if you're going to be bombing our troops, we are going to retaliate against you. So we're going to talk about that as well. So without further ado, drum roll, I would love to bring in our special guest for today, Barbara Slavin. I'm delighted to have her on the show. She is the director of the Future of the Iran Initiative and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She also lectures in international affairs at George Washington University. She is the author of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the US, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. And she's a regular commentator on US foreign policy in Iran on NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN, and now Samanthropolitics. A career journalist, Slavin previously served as assistant managing editor for World and National Security of the Washington Times, senior diplomatic reporter for USA Today, Cairo correspondent for The Economist, and an editor for the New York Times Week in Review. She's covered things like terrorism, rogue states, Iran, Iraq, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. She's also served as a policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where she wrote Bitter Friends, and as a senior fellow at the USIP, where she researched and wrote the report Mullahs, Money, and Militias, How Iran Exerts Its Influence in the Middle East. So, Barbara, I'm happy to bring you on the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to be with you. So before we start talking about Iran, I am just so intrigued by this picture behind you of this gentleman, this regal gentleman kissing your hand. Can you tell me who that is?
I don't have many pictures with foreign leaders, but this one I couldn't resist. That's Jacques Chirac, the late president of France, who I interviewed twice. And in this particular case, I think it was in 2003. It was a couple of months after the United States had invaded Iraq. And France opposed this. France said it would be a terrible decision. And Chirac knew a great deal about the Middle East. He was right. We were wrong. But I enjoyed very much having this interview with him. He spoke pretty good English. He had spent time in the United States. He talked about how much he enjoyed being a young person in the US. He was a student here for a while. Oh. He liked hamburgers and he liked Budweiser beer, he told me. But this was a period when there was tremendous anti-France propaganda in the US. The US was really pissed that the French did not support the invasion of Iraq. They talked about freedom fries, not French fries.
Right, I forgot about that.
It was insane anti-French behavior. And of course, the French knew the Middle East much better, certainly much better than George W. Bush, and they were right. We were wrong. So this is a picture I'm proud of. He I think he got involved in corruption. He wasn't. The French may not like him as much as I did, but I respected his views on foreign policy.
I feel like if Macron kissed my hand, or like Trudeau's like my celebrity crush.
Well,
like
Trudeau is cuter, but
I would die.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that period, because you've been researching the Middle East for a long time. So this news that Donald Rumsfeld, who's kind of a legend in a lot of ways, has died. What are your thoughts on that, and kind of how did he set up the Middle East for where we're at talking about it today?
Yeah, well, he was brought in by Dick Cheney, who in George W. Bush's first term was really the president of the United States. Cheney was the vice president, but he ran the show, particularly on foreign policy. And it was Cheney and the people around him who thought that Saddam Hussein in Iraq was unfinished business and that the United States should go in and get rid of him, because there was a chance that he might have weapons of mass destruction that he would use against the United States. And this was, of course, after the September 11, 2001 attacks. Younger people will not remember this, but the entire country went essentially nuts, because we had never been attacked in our homeland like that. And for those who've seen the terrible pictures of that apartment complex in Florida that collapsed, well, you can imagine if you were watching in live time while the World Trade Center in New York City collapsed, because crazy terrorists had flown planes into the building. So I think the country went a little bit crazy, and the decision was first go into Afghanistan, get rid of the government there because they had harbored Al-Qaeda, which was responsible for 9/11. And then, by the way, why don't we just go in and get rid of Saddam Hussein, because, Iraq isn't that far from Afghanistan, and we don't like this guy anyway, and we think we can do it easily. And Rumsfeld was the defense secretary. He was brought in. I don't think he really cared about what happened in Iraq after Saddam fell. There was very little planning for the day after. And it didn't take very long to get rid of Saddam Hussein, but the problem was we had no clue what to do once he was gone. And the country devolved into chaos. There was no security. The remnants of Saddam's party formed up into guerrilla groups which attacked American troops. And I mean, if you're looking at Iraq today, it's not a successful state. Almost 20 years later, this is still not a successful state. And what's more, it's dominated by Iran, which is an adversary of the United States. So in hindsight, but I have to say, I was one of very few journalists at the time who said, wait a minute, this is not a great idea.
Well, why were you one of I'm actually surprised by that. Why were you one of very few journalists?
Because I had lived in the Middle East in the 1980s. I had been to Iraq 3 times. I knew something about the country, the fact that it had no democratic traditions. I didn't trust the exiles who were in the United States pushing for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, who were peddling all kinds of what turned out to be fake information about so-called weapons of mass destruction. These guys just wanted to go back and take over. It was entirely selfish, and it had nothing to do with U.S. national interests. May I say that Bibi Netanyahu also pushed for this because the Israelis thought that Iraq might be some sort of threat. And in fact, Bibi gave some testimony, which is infamous, about how getting rid of Saddam would somehow resolve our problems in the Middle East. It didn't.
It didn't, right?
It didn't. It made things worse.
It seems like it's such a masculine ego decision. Of like, we just want to go blow stuff up, and get rid of this bad guy.
George W. Bush had been governor of Texas. He didn't know anything about foreign policy. He trusted Rummy and he trusted Cheney, who were veterans of previous Republican administrations, and he was led around by the frigging nose by those people. I have another picture back here. You probably can't see.
Here, I'm gonna screen out
very well.
Yeah,
this
we can
is
see it.
Colin Powell. It's a rather faint picture. He was the Secretary of State. He was a damn good guy. He knew this was a mistake, and he did his best to try to prevent this war. He insisted that the U.S. go to the UN Security Council, try to get permission from the international community. He did his best, but he was completely steamrolled by Rumsfeld, who was an arrogant SOB, who looked down on Powell, who looked down on everyone. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. So, I mean, very good for him. He died in the bosom of his family at age 88, but he left a real trail of misery. A real trail of misery. I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Have you muted yourself? You've muted yourself. There you go.
That was amateur 101.
Yeah.
And the other thing about Iraq was that that one of the main pieces of evidence for mass destruction was evidence from an Egyptian national that was gained through torture, that he said that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And like, when you're torturing people,
yeah,
they're going to say whatever you want.
It mostly came from a guy codenamed Curveball, who was an Iraqi in Germany. It turned out the whole thing was completely fabricated. And the information was presented by a man named Ahmed Chalabi, who was an Iraqi emigre and played footsie with a lot of different people. Anyway, there are many good books written about it, and I hope we've learned our lesson. We will see.
We will see.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you this question later, but I'm going to ask you now because I think it's a better. You mention in your commentary in Responsible Statecraft that you don't think that we need to have troops in the Middle East anymore.
No, I didn't say that. I said that we don't need such a large footprint.
Okay.
We have 50, 60,000 troops there. I don't think we need that many. I think we can have a smaller footprint and keep forces in Europe and in Asia, and they're available if we need. But there's a kind of, if you have a presence, it leads to a reaction. So you mentioned the attacks in Syria and Iraq on these Shia militias. Why are they sending drones to attack Americans? Because they don't think the United States should be in Iraq anymore. And as long as we are there, we are going to be antagonizing someone, and there will be groups that will attack, and then we will retaliate to quote unquote deter. But I mean, who is 5,000 miles from home and who is in their own country? Why are we there? Why are we there anymore? ISIS is pretty much defeated. If it rears its ugly head again, we can always go back in. Do we really need to be there? The Iraqi government, we are there because they want us there. But I sometimes think, frankly, that we're causing more trouble than it's worth. And so that's why I wrote that. I think we could reduce those numbers from 50, 60,000 to 20, 30,000 based there, and that would be perfectly adequate.
Well, what's interesting too is even when we went into Iraq, there's a documentary about kind of showing how, we don't roll up softly. We roll up with tanks and guns and, we're like, hey, it's America, what's up? And in these cultures of honor, we did the same thing in Afghanistan where we were, knocking on doors at night and knocking down doors. And in these cultures of honor, they don't like to see other men just walk in and set up shop and take over. And so that prompted even some of the rebel action against Americans at the very beginning of the Iraq War.
Yeah, well, we should not have dissolved the Iraqi army. We should have kept the civil service that was working under Saddam Hussein. They should not all have been fired. Many of them had to join the ruling party, the Ba'ath Party. They had no choice.
Who made that decision, Barbara? Like, who made that erroneous? Was it Rumsfeld? Such a bad decision.
And a man named Paul Bremer, who was our czar, our Iraq czar in the country and ran the place for a while. It was Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of State. It was Dick Cheney and the people around him, neoconservatives who thought that we had to get rid of the entire ruling structure of the country, which just opened the door to chaos. So many, many, many bad decisions. And Rumsfeld signed off on these.
And do you agree with there's a Frontline documentary that talks about the rise of ISIS, that the dissolve of the army was pivotal because a lot of the Sunnis
that's
were
where
in
they
ISIS.
got their. That's where they got their troops. First, we had something called Al Qaeda in Iraq, and that morphed into ISIS. These were many of them people who had been arrested by the United States and tortured, mistreated, put in prisons in Iraq, and they found religion in prison and reemerged as the Islamic State. Yeah.
Oh, man, I could talk to you about this for ages. So let's go to today. So we've got this new president of Iran. I'm trying to understand because he's more conservative than Rouhani. Why did they block all of the moderates from running?
Well, the country is not run by the president. It's run by somebody appropriately called the supreme leader,
Right.
a cleric named Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And he's 82, and he's worried about the survival of this unique system of government, which has been there since 1979, which has, a cleric on top and then some elected offices, many unelected bodies that are even more influential. And he wants, one theory is that he wants Ibrahim Raisi to be the next supreme leader, and he's grooming him. He's been bringing him up through the system now for more than a decade. He wants to consolidate power in the hands of this hardline faction. And the more moderate, the factions that are more open to, say, good relations with the West, they've had several chances in Iran, and unfortunately, when they have been ready to improve relations with the United States and the West, the United States has often not been ready or has taken steps that have undercut them. So after 9/11, the president was a reformer named Mohammad Khatami, who really did reach out to the United States. And actually, Iran helped the US get rid of the Taliban in Afghanistan back in 2001. Then George W. Bush gave a speech where he put Iran on something called the axis of evil. After they helped us.
Stupid.
Helped us.
So dumb.
Lump them in with Saddam Hussein and North Korea.
Right.
Guess what? Iran had elections in 2005 and got an awful man named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as president, who denied the Holocaust, who accelerated Iran's nuclear program, and was altogether a dreadful, dreadful president. Okay, Obama is elected. Iran has presidential elections in 2013, and Rouhani, who is, I wouldn't call him a liberal, but is someone who is an experienced diplomat, a former nuclear negotiator, educated partly in the West. He comes in, he puts in a team of people who are very experienced dealing with the West and the United States. They negotiate something called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. Goes into effect. 9 months later, Donald Trump is elected. Trump campaigns against the deal, undercuts the deal, does a bunch of things like the Muslim ban as soon as he comes in, prevents Iranians from coming to this country, people from other Muslim countries, starts threatening Iran. And in 2018, he withdraws from the deal, even though Iran was in full compliance with it, had rolled back its nuclear program, imposes more and more and more sanctions on Iran. Backlash. What do we get? The Rouhani faction has been defeated, has been embarrassed, humiliated, and now we get Ibrahim Raisi, who frankly is in some ways worse than Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
You think so? Why?
This guy has blood on his hands, as you pointed out, directly, and is also much more disciplined, not as flamboyant and crazy as Ahmadinejad. This guy is a stone cold killer.
You're giving me chills, Barbara.
He's head of the judiciary, which has been responsible for repressing dissent in Iran, as well as his activities back in the 1980s when he was a young prosecutor. But silver lining, the conservative factions now own the entire system, the parliament, the presidency, supreme leader, judiciary, everything. So everything that goes wrong in that country, everything that doesn't go right, will be blamed on them. And having
and
been,
hopefully then they'll get voted out.
well, I don't know if they'll get voted out, but I've been to Iran 9 times. These are incredible people, well-educated, thoughtful people. They will find a way. They will find a way to show that this government does not represent them. And we've already seen that with this incredible election boycott. It wasn't just that only 48% voted, which is very low for Iran. But of that, another, I think, 10% or so put in invalid or blank ballots.
Oh, interesting.
So in effect, Raisi was elected with the support of about 25 to 30% of registered voters. So he is a true minority president. His base is very small. And if he can't improve the economy, if he can't lighten up on some of the repression, make life better for people, he's going to be very unpopular. Even more unpopular than he already is. And I have faith in these people. They are, there have been reports of strikes by oil workers recently. There will be civil disturbances. I mean, the regime can't arrest everybody. And the society has evolved a lot. When you look at women, for example, when I started going there in the 1990s, you had to be completely draped in black. Now women barely observe the Islamic dress code. People live lives the way they want to, and it's just, they're not supporting this system of government anymore. And frankly, that's why they eliminated all of the opposition candidates, because they were terrified that otherwise Raisi would not win.
Yeah, we did a show on Clubhouse in Iran with two young Iranian American women, or not young, but Iranian American women and human rights activists and researchers. And so, what was so interesting on that show was basically how creative they were in terms of being like, okay, we can't get on Facebook, we can't get on all this. We're going to go on Clubhouse, this new technology.
Yeah. And I mean, Clubhouse will probably be suppressed, but then something else will happen. They've gone from WhatsApp, Telegram.
So Telegram. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, they find a way, and I find actually that Iranians are better educated and better informed. I mean, 80% of Iranians believe Joe Biden won the election.
Oh no, what are we?
The percentage in this country is less.
Don't tell me, I'm scared. How much is it in our country?
I don't know, but there are a bunch who don't believe it. Hey, I can show you another picture. Here's another picture.
I love this. I feel like I'm in Barbara's house.
Let me tell. All right, so that's me in the shrine city of Qum. I'm here. Well, wait a minute. There I am.
Amazing.
So that's what you had to look like,
wow.
20 years ago. And now, I mean, almost anything goes, right?
Wow. Unbelievable. It really is amazing, like the progress of the country. What about the JCPOA? So first of all, I still find it hilarious that they came up with the longest name ever for it. Like, I can see why it's called the Iran deal, because like no one can remember the acronym JCP, Joint Committee.
Joint Comprehensive Plan. In Farsi, in the Iranian language, it's Barjam, which I think is much easier. Frankly.
Wait, let's just call it Barjam.
Barjam.
Yeah. So is it correct that the U.S. and Iran don't negotiate with each other, but negotiate through intermediaries?
Yeah. See, Trump pulled out of the deal.
Right.
And so the U.S. is technically not a participant in the agreement anymore. And so the Iranians, just to play with our heads, basically, said, okay, well, we'll negotiate with you, but we won't sit in the same room because you're not a member anymore. So the official members are the other members of the UN Security Council, permanent members, Russia, China, Britain, France, plus Germany and the European Union. So basically the Europeans meet with the Iranians, and then they come across the street to the hotel where the Americans are and tell them what the Iranians said.
What a nightmare.
what the Americans say and take it back to the Iranians. That's
feel
why
bad for the Europeans.
that's why it's taking so long. That's why it's taking so long, because it's indirect. And of course, the original JCPOA was negotiated directly.
That's so interesting. And then what are your thoughts on how will Raisi affect the JC? And people are even saying, like, why are they still negotiating the JCPOA until Raisi kind of takes power?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you think we should be doing this right now, or should we be waiting for him to take power? And what effect do you think he'll have on the JCPOA?
No, I definitely, we should be doing this now, because the team that is there is the team that originally negotiated it. They're the best people to be talking to.
Interesting.
Also, the president is not in charge of foreign policy in Iran. The supreme leader and the security organs of the country have a much bigger say. Iran has something called the Supreme Council on National Security. It's kind of like their NSC. And you have on that a representative of the supreme leader, the president, the heads of the various armed forces branches, the intelligence branches, and they come together and make a decision about what the foreign policy will be. So this isn't going to change when Raisi comes in. What unfortunately will change, though, is the cabinet. And I'm very worried that the people he will bring in, the foreign minister in particular, will be hardliners who have a real deep animosity toward the United States. And so if we're not back in the agreement by then, I think it's going to be very difficult. Also, in terms of negotiating any kind of follow-on agreement, I'm not very optimistic about that, not with the type of people who are likely to be in charge of the various ministries when Raisi comes in.
One thing that I've heard, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that a sticking point in the negotiations is that Iran wants all sanctions lifted, and that we're not willing to do that. Where is the compromise on that?
It's a negotiating tactic, look, and we want them to do a number of things with their nuclear program that they're probably not happy about doing. I think that this is still just in the bargaining, stage. They want all the sanctions that Trump reimposed and added taken away. But some of those sanctions were imposed because of human rights violations or other reasons not connected with the nuclear program. So what the U.S. has said, what Rob Malley, our special envoy, has said, is that the U.S. will remove all sanctions inconsistent with the JCPOA. And so now the question is, how do you define inconsistent? And so that's part of what they've been haggling over.
Also, how do you? But Barbara, I'm going to stop you there. How do you define inconsistent? What does that mean? It sounds like vague language.
Yeah, to me, it means all of the sanctions that prevent Iran from selling oil and from repatriating earnings and from having a normal functioning of its economy. Having access to bank accounts and normal banking transactions. Sanctions on Iran's automotive industry. I mean, why? What happened under Trump is he just went crazy. Mike Pompeo, in particular, went crazy and just sanctioned.
I can't imagine that happening.
Yeah,
I can't imagine that happening. It's so not like them. Just kidding.
Yeah, well, he's running for president and he wants to show how anti-Iran
how tough he is.
Yeah,
tough guy.
Yeah, tough guy. So, I mean, a lot of these sanctions were, frankly, absurd. On Iran's shipping industry, on Iran's insurance, ability to get insurance for its oil exports. These things are inconsistent with the nuclear deal, which promised Iran economic relief in return for curbs on its program such that it would not have sufficient material to make a nuclear weapon until at least the year 2031. If then. I think everybody knows pretty much what's involved, but the system, the supreme leader and the hardliners kind of slowed everything down because they wanted to make sure that Raisi won. And one way to make sure he won was to make sure that the so-called moderates had nothing to show, namely that the deal had not been restored, the economy was still in the tank. There was one nominal reformist candidate, make sure that he could not win. And so now that the elections are passed, I think we will see some progress on this, hopefully, before Ricey is inaugurated on August the 3rd.
So there's something else that you said in the Responsible Statecraft article, that the consolidation of power in Iran among conservatives may facilitate a decrease in regional tensions as the incoming Raisi administration needs to focus on repairing Iran's sanctions and COVID-battered economy. So interested to hear what what regional tensions might decrease and what your view is on that.
Well, the Iranians have already been talking to the Saudis. They've had back-channel discussions in Iraq. And I think they're mostly about Yemen, which of course has been an enormous, has world's worst humanitarian disaster and an enormous drain on the Saudi economy in particular. I think the Saudis want out of there. But they also want to guarantee that the Houthi rebels, who are supported to some extent by Iran, will stop shooting rockets into Saudi Arabia. So I think that's part of it. I think they're talking about reopening embassies. They're talking about Iranian pilgrims being able to go to Saudi Arabia for the Hajj, this very important Muslim pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. So I hope that these talks make progress. I think that would help reduce tensions considerably in the region if the Iranians and the Saudis can reach some sort of understanding.
Do you think that, people talk about like kind of fundamental opposition with regards to religion, that Iran being majority Shia and Saudi being majority Sunni, do you think they can kind of overlook that, big religious difference to?
No, no, they won't overlook it, but these are the two big powers in the region. And at some level, I think they need to be able to communicate with each other. Also, Saudi Arabia has a Shia minority, Arab Shia minority, in its eastern province where the oil is. And Iran can have some influence on the level of dissent or not in the Shia areas of Saudi Arabia. Iran can have some influence in Bahrain, which is run by Sunnis, but has a Shia majority, an indigenous Shia majority. And, Iran can, make sure that they're not sending weapons in or carrying out supporting acts of terrorism in Bahrain or in eastern Saudi Arabia.
Another question, what is the Gulf Cooperation Council? What is it supposed to do, and then why is it so dysfunctional?
Yeah, the GCC. It was set up after the Iranian Revolution of 1979 because, frankly, all of these monarchies were terrified of the revolution in Iran, which overthrew a monarch, and were very afraid that this revolutionary ideology would spread. So they formed this grouping called the Gulf Cooperation Council. They are the Arab countries on the other side of the Persian Gulf. It is the Persian Gulf from Iran. They supported Iraq under Saddam Hussein. There was a terrible war from 1980 to 1988, the Iran-Iraq War. Killed or wounded 1 million people. It was a vicious conflict. And the Arabs supported Saddam. The United States supported him too, which is one of the
ironies of
enduring grievances. I'm sorry. I have my laptop in the wrong place, I'm told. Is that better?
That's better.
Okay, sorry about that. So this is one of the enduring grievances of the Iranians against the United States. The U.S. also shot down, by the way, a civilian Iranian airliner in 1988, killing almost 300 people on board. Not something that's talked about much. We only talk about Iran's malign behavior, right? We never talk about what the United States has done.
It was a passenger jet?
Yeah, it was a passenger jet, and the captain of a U.S. Navy ship called the Vincennes mistook it for a military plane and shot it down.
What year was that?
1988.
That's terrible.
Yeah, and these sanctions kill people.
Yeah.
Iran has not been able to get food, medicine, even to deal with COVID. they have suffered tremendously. So this is a form of economic warfare. We may not like it that these Iraqi militias are sending drones against Americans in Iraq, but Iran has its grievances too.
Yeah, we were even talking about how there's a lot of research showing how sanctions have affected women and how badly they've affected women, and how women filmmakers who are trying to make documentaries showing how the conservative right is flawed can't get the money from Europe to make the films.
Yeah,
so it's
more
like,
than that,
you
they've been
know,
driven out of the workforce.
yeah, and that too. It's been like a worse recession than America.
Kind of like what happened here, but worse, because Iranian female participation in the labor force is much lower. But because of COVID, a lot of businesses shut down. And of course, who suffers the most? Women.
Women.
Right? Yeah, always women. So there have been a number of papers that have been written about this and about the anti-feminist nature of economic sanctions, among many other things. But beyond that, the sanctions is more active, more aggressive in the region, enormously, more than even where they were before we reached the nuclear deal in 2015. So thank you, Donald Trump.
So you're saying that there's...
Yeah. Oh, and then we killed Iran's biggest military
let's
hero.
talk about that. Talk about
We
male...
assassinated him with a drone, but
like a male ego thing.
How dare Iran do anything against the United States? No, we can kill with impunity, but no, Iran can't. And the Israelis have killed a bunch of Iranian scientists as well, and sabotage Iranian infrastructure, because the Israelis do what the Israelis want to do. Yeah.
Okay. So this is a good segue to go to Israel. I mean, we have Naftali Bennett being elected literally the same time as Ricey.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. I mean, what do you think the new chemistry is between the two? Like, how is this going to proceed?
There's no chemistry between them. But the chemistry between Naftali Bennett and his government and the Biden administration will be better. We can already see this. And in fact, we see that the Biden administration is totally embracing this government. I mean, Biden called Bennett like 2 hours after he became prime minister. We've had meetings. Our Secretary of State has met with their foreign minister, Lapid. The outgoing president of Israel, was just a guest at the White House, Rivlin. It's like we can't be nicer to them. And one of the reasons is we don't want Israel screwing around with our Iran policy. We want them to accept that the United States is trying to get back into this agreement and not to continue to sabotage it, as Bibi did pretty much throughout.
You think Bennett is going to be less of a saboteur to the resumption of the Iran deal?
Yeah, I think because of the nature of his coalition also, it's so broad. He's not going to get support from this vast spectrum of Israeli political opinion for things that upset the United States. He's going to need to check in and coordinate more than Netanyahu did. And the Israeli policy is still that the JCPOA was a lousy deal. But I just don't think they're going to be as in your face about it as Bibi was.
Of racist anti-Semitism, like rabid anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Who knows? I mean, most Iranians are not anti-Jewish. They have a much lower opinion of Arabs than they do of Jews.
How interesting.
Jews have lived in Iran for 5,000 years, and there's still about 10,000 of them in the country. A lot of them left to the United States and to Israel after the revolution, but there's still a bunch in places like Hamadan, a few other cities, Isfahan. This is the standard rhetoric. It's the standard line. And how much he believes it or not, I mean, after the revolution, the leadership of Iran was desperate to show that this was a pan-Islamic revolution, that it wasn't just a Shia thing. And so they embraced the Palestinian cause very strongly at that time. And that's one of the reasons that you still see Iranian support for groups like Hamas and so on, that they identify with the Palestinian cause. But most Iranians could care less about the Palestinians. They're worried about getting through the day and putting food on the table. So I wouldn't pay that much attention. Raisi is going to have to focus on the economy. He's going to have to focus on improving the situation day to day for people. And if he can't do that, he is going to be a failure, and the system is going to continue to lose support, even more support.
Right, and they know that the only way they can get the U.S. to withdraw any sort of sanctions is to make some sort of concessions to the U.S. I mean,
they have to come back into the original deal. They have to agree to roll back all the steps that they've taken since 2019, stockpiles of uranium, higher enriched uranium, this kind of thing.
Yeah. So I want to go back to women's rights. Usually when somebody more conservative is elected, it's, like what we're worried about in Afghanistan happening, and the Taliban takes over and sadly is making, headway right now, that women's rights will be rolled back. Or do you see that happening at all in this particular case?
I don't think so in the same way, just because Iranian women are so kick-ass, and they have come such a long way. I can't share the screen, but I mean, especially in the big cities, they're just not, they're not going to take it. And women are well educated. They're looking for economic opportunities. No, I don't think Raisi is going to make that much of a difference. I mean, you can't lock up everybody. So if a woman lets her scarf fall down on her shoulder, I mean, how many of them can you lock up?
Yeah.
It's just not going to work. And he's going to have to try to do some things to be more popular. So if they crack down harder on women, I think that would just defeat the purpose. I hope I'm right. I mean, there are a number of fantastic women who are rotting in prison in Iran now, women's rights advocates, lawyers. And, if he really wanted to be popular, he could let some of these women out of jail, but that may be too much to ask.
Yeah, one of the women that was on our show, she has not been back. She escaped Iran when she was jailed. She was jailed, somehow got out. She escaped the country. She can't go back because she will.
No, nobody can. I haven't been there since 2013. I mean, if you get to know too much, they don't want you there anymore. And for Iranians, dual nationals and Iranian nationals, it's just dangerous because you'll go back and they'll take your passport and, bye-bye.
So there's something else that happened that I find really interesting is that this is a recent news as well, that the U.S. just seized websites used by Iranian Islamic Radio and Television Union, 3 websites operated by Kataib Hezbollah in violation of U.S. sanctions. And they were saying that these were disguised as news organizations or media outlets and were targeting the U.S. with disinformation campaigns and malign influence operations. What can you dive a little bit deeper into this, or what do you know about this?
Well, I think some of the domains were U.S. domains, and so they were technically violating sanctions by allowing these Iranian.
Because they were owned by U.S.
Yeah, allowing these Iranian media outlets to use these domain names. But they just switched to other domains, and they're back on. And I didn't think it had a good look, frankly. I thought it looked like it was. Are we so weak that we can't listen to what the Iranians have to say and make our own judgments about it? One of the sites they went after is something called Press TV, which is an English language streaming service, and it's very useful, frankly, because if you want to watch the debates that they had before the Iranian presidential election or the press conferences that Raisi was giving. They have simultaneous translation into English. So it's very helpful for researchers like myself, analysts, to be able to watch. And I'm smart enough to know what's true and what's BS. And I found it, I don't think we should be in the business of suppressing these kinds of things. I think people can make up their own mind. It's, if we're talking about sabotage of our infrastructure, cyber war or something, that's something different. But in terms of their media outlets, no, I thought that was ridiculous. I mean, we have our own propaganda, don't we?
Yeah. I just think about that I feel like the US is trying to just like up its cyber game. And so maybe they're just kind of just going after whatever to show like
thing. It was technical violations and the
of the
Treasury
sanctions.
Department just doing what the Treasury Department does. But it wasn't a good look, no.
Yeah. And it, it scares you. I had a notification because I do a lot of work as a diversity and inclusion trainer, my day job. And, we got a notice the other day that basically was like a warning. It was like, do not do business with North Korea, like Syria, Iran, like big X, like don't talk to anyone from that region. And it really is like, I mean, they're kind of cut off from the world in a sense.
We should be trying to talk to these people. I mean, how are you supposed to make progress? How are you supposed to influence people if you're barring contact with them?
Right. And how can we empower moderates who are trying to like build their own businesses or build the economy? I mean, I'm a small business owner. Every small business owner plays their role in building the economy. They can't do business with other countries. That just severely limits. I mean, the US market is huge in terms of the money that we have here.
Yeah, and Iran, I mean, they have beautiful things. It's not just Persian carpets and saffron. I mean, they make beautiful things that they could sell. They have wonderful modern art, which is sold in galleries at quite a premium. We should be learning more about them. They should be learning more about us.
Right. And what these women were saying is that most Iranians are not anti-American. They actually like American culture. They're like, they want to be friends with Americans. There's not this anti-American sentiment that I think is that Trump really peddled and said, Iran hates the US and anti-American, blah, blah, blah. But they're really not like that.
No, this is propaganda. This is government rhetoric. But unfortunately, with sanctions, repeated sanctions, and with the erratic nature of our governments, where there's no consistency, there's no continuity in our policies, we go from one extreme to the other. I think there may be more and more Iranians who, frankly, are sick of us and say, well, let's focus on China because their government doesn't change every 4 years.
Right. And I mean, they could even, I'm wondering with the JCPOA, could they even look at it and say, I mean, Trump's gearing up for his next, he's having campaign rallies already, which is terrifying. I mean, could they say, we're going to spend all this time negotiating this deal and then, I mean, inshallah, this won't happen, like that Trump will be reelected and the deal's gone again. Like,
well, actually, that's one of the things that they're raising in these talks in Vienna. What is the guarantee that if we roll back our nuclear program again, that this agreement is going to stick? Or is, what happens in 2024 if Joe Biden is no longer president and the next president decides to reimpose sanctions? Yeah. So, I mean, they have a point.
Yeah, they absolutely do. The last question I want to ask you, because we've actually been talking about economic sanctions with quite a few guests, can you dive more into the anti-feminist nature of economic sanctions? Because I hadn't really heard of that, and I'm totally fascinated.
Yeah. Well, these sanctions, especially the blanket sanctions that affect the overall economy of a country, whether it's Iran or North Korea or Venezuela or Iraq under Saddam Hussein in the 1990s, what they do is they impact the general population. The insiders in the regime always get access to hard currency, to however limited it may be. They get access to it. They monopolize control over hard currency. But what usually happens is the currency collapses, inflation skyrockets. And so the people who suffer are the ordinary people. Right. Iranians who can't afford meat anymore. I mean, the currency has, I'm trying to think of how bad it is now. I think it's about 240,000 rials to the dollar now. It was 35,000 when the nuclear deal was reached. So you do the math. And at one point, it was as bad as, I think, 340,000 rials to the dollar, which meant that if you were trying to import something, you had to pay for it in foreign currency. You couldn't afford it. And even inputs for your own domestic production, like pharmaceuticals, they make 90% of their own medicine, but they have to import materials. And the price of those materials has gone up astronomically because of the collapse in the value of the currency. That's what sanctions do. So if you're thinking about a woman who's trying to provide for her family, trying to buy food to put on the table, trying to take care of the health and the education of her family, everything becomes harder. I can assure you that the supreme leader of the country, that Ibrahim Raisi, they didn't suffer one bit under sanctions. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps did not suffer. In fact, they expanded their control over the Iranian economy because they are in charge of smuggling the oil out and getting whatever they could back. But the average person on the street, they suffered. So I think that sanctions, these kinds of sanctions, are immoral and frankly criminal.
So is the other, I mean, because economic sanctions have been used as like the diplomatic tool for ages in U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, because we don't want to send troops, so we think, we'll sanction.
Well, we'll sanction them. So what is the alternative targeted sanctions, or is it supporting civil society? Like, what do you see as the other like levers that we can pull?
If you want to pick individual human rights abusers and say, if you can't have a bank account in the United States, fine. Someone who you can directly attach to acts of terrorism, sanction them individually, fine. But blanket sanctions, no. Against a whole country, no. Maximum pressure is maximum cruelty. That's what
maximum pressure is maximum cruelty. I think that's a really good
I think I once told somebody from the New York Times it was sadism masquerading as foreign policy.
Wow. Wow, it gives me chills. It was sadism masquerading as foreign policy because it's so cruel to people.
Easy for us. I mean, we haven't done business with Iran for 40 years. What do we care, right? But you have to think of the consequences. Oh, let's say also Iran is now totally reliant on China. And isn't China our big adversary now? Right. So explain to me how this is in U.S. national interest.
Right, because it's pushing it right into the arms of China.
Yeah.
But so just to push you a little bit more on this, but so what is if we were to stop using sanctions as our like main weapon, that our diplomatic weapon, like what are our other tools in our toolkit?
Well, we could try some incentives instead of punishment. We could offer to lift some of more sanctions. We could offer to trade. We could offer to talk more and try to understand where Iran is coming from and why it does what it does. We could stop putting countries on axes of evil. It may make us feel good. I don't know. Maybe it made George W. Bush feel like a big,
a man.
A man, yes. It made him feel like he had a big one. But it didn't serve any earthly purpose, and it undercut people in Iran who wanted to have a relationship with the United States. Having more women in positions of authority might help.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. It was so when you were talking about the decision making in Iraq, every single person you mentioned that was making a decision was a man.
Man.
Yeah.
Well, Condi Rice was a fellow traveler,
Rice.
And she didn't know enough about the Middle East to object, and she allowed herself to be totally dominated by Rumsfeld and Cheney in the first term. Totally.
Yeah. I just think we need to kind of reorient our foreign policy and our tools of looking at like really taking a hard look at sanctions and saying, like prioritizing the other things that you talked about, incentives, opportunities, getting to know, the other country, listening, like God forbid. But I feel like, that has to enter like the mainstream lexicon of foreign policy operations as tools that you use instead of just, okay, we put boots on the ground, we back rebel militias, and we use economic sanctions.
Yeah.
That seems to be like
and
the
drones.
triad.
Let's not forget
drones. And drone strikes.
We assassinate people from the air.
Yeah, exactly. Because that really wins us a lot of friends, right? Barbara, this has been an absolute pleasure. I wish we were in the same studio so I could be hanging out with you right now since we're both in DC and we could trade books. But I just want to really thank you for coming on the show.
Sure, it's been fun, and I love reaching a new generation out there.
Yeah, it's just so great to hear from somebody so, as brilliant as you, and just to tie together, because all of these, when we talk about all of these countries, we have such a long history with all of them. And so, you've really been looking at this for so long that I think it really helps to be like, okay, what happened here? What happened with this person? How did this shift? And I think you really were able to put things into a frame for us to understand the current situation and how this will or may play out. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And good luck with your venture. It's terrific.
Thank you, Barbara. Take care.
All right. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So that was Barbara Slavin with us. Fascinating, the anti-feminist nature of economic sanctions, and I loved her line that maximum pressure is maximum cruelty, and that the sanctions were sadism masquerading as foreign policy. I think that's so important to think about, that when we do foreign policy, whether it is economic sanctions or frankly drone strikes or a war in Iraq or, torturing people, which we did during 9/11 and putting them in CIA black sites and being like, "Oh, well, not on our soil. It's okay. We can torture these people." Like that is sadism. It's cruelty. It's like she was saying, it's criminal. But when it's closed, when it's masked in this concept of foreign policy, it's like, oh, well, it's serving our strategic interests. Like, it's okay. And like all of the time, applying cruelty, applying sadism, even drone strikes have really backfired on us. That sadism doesn't really work. It just earns us more enemies than it does friends. So I just want to recognize Barbara for really highlighting that really important point and starting to think about, are we excusing some really sadistic policies just because they're called policy, which kind of clothes what it is that we're actually doing, whether it's torturing or drone strikes. I mean, we think about drone strikes, we've bombed Medicine Sans Frontier hospitals, Doctors Without Border hospitals in Afghanistan, and killed people there. I mean, that is horrendous. Like, that was not intentional. That was not our policy. But we've had lots of collateral damage, which means civilians being killed when we were going after terrorists, right? So I think it's so important, and also to think about taking a step back on always using drones or military equipment or backing rebel militias as the way to do policy. All right. So that was a great show. I'm so excited Barbie was able to come on. Again, that was Barbara Slavin, the director of the Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. I want to thank our sponsor today, Stream Inspectors. If you see this wonderful setup, all the cool graphics, the cool image you saw promoting the show, that was all Zach and his team at Stream Inspectors. They are the leaders in live production. So if you're looking for live streaming, you have to go to Stream Inspectors. They're the best. Just make sure they still have enough time to do my show. Don't take them away from me. I also wanted to say that in addition to this, I run a company called Empower Global, and right now we are recruiting for our next women's leadership training. So if you want to become a woman like Barbara or Jan Cummings or lots of other amazing women that we've had on our show, we train future women leaders. So it's groups of 8 women each. It's amazing. The women become really, really tight. It's a supportive community of women who encourage one another, who troubleshoot with one another. And we teach things like speaking truth to power, doing public advocacy, recognizing your own power, building community, deconstructing your inner patriarchy and systemic patriarchy, and how do you take away things like economic sanctions and what is the gendered effect of those. So again, we're accepting applications for our 2 upcoming cohorts. One will be virtual and one will be live and in person in Washington, D.C. So we're putting the link to that, the Women's Leadership Challenge, in the chat. You get to hang out with me for 10 weeks. And I teach you some really cool stuff, and you meet other amazing women from around the world. So that link is in the chat. We have another show tomorrow, which I'm really excited about. So Greg Abbott and Donald Trump were at the border today, spouting anti-immigrant rhetoric as usual. And I'm super excited because tomorrow we have the head of mobilization at Lupe, which is an organization that works with immigrants on the border, coming to talk to us about the immigration issue, children at the border, what Abbott and Trump are trying to do, as well as Naya Diaz, who works as the executive director of YWCA Austin. And she works with tons of immigrant women. And so we're going to have them on the show tomorrow talking about immigration, critical race theory, lots of really important issues going on right now in our country. So that is tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. And then lastly, if you like this show, please like it on Facebook, comment on it, share it, send it to your mother, your sister, your uncle, your grandfather, whatever. It's really appreciated to get the word out if you want other people to be educated on these global issues. And then please consider donating on Patreon, becoming a member of Samanthropolitics. You get cool features like getting to ask advanced questions, getting to suggest show topics, getting to suggest guests. So check out what we offer on Patreon and consider becoming a member and subscribing. It really helps us so that we can do more of these episodes and stay afloat. So without further ado, I just want to thank everyone for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. That's it tonight for Samanthropolitics. Good night.